Good afternoon, everyone. Today, we're going to be discussing relevant, meaningful learning outcomes in the Gen AI era. My name is David Arumba. I am an instructional designer with the digital learning team at the Center for Excellence in Learning and Teaching, and I'll pass it over to my colleague, Jackie.
Hey everyone, I'm Jackie Dang. I'm an educational developer at the Teaching and Development team at the Center for Excellence in Learning and Teaching as well. If you want a copy of these slides to follow along, David has just pasted the link into our chat, and you can also scan the QR code on the screen as well to navigate the slides on your own as well. So just to give everyone an overview of the agenda for today, or the learning outcomes, sorry. So the goals for this workshop are that by the end of this workshop, you'll be able to identify the key components and attributes of well-written course level learning outcomes, CLOs, as we'll be referring to them throughout the presentation. We'll examine some situational factors that impact how you teach with and about generative artificial intelligence, GenAI, in your courses, and then assess and adapt existing CLOs for relevance and effectiveness in a GenAI landscape. The agenda for today's session, we're going to start with a section on writing learning outcomes that David will lead us through. Part B will be preparing for GenAI, and then Part C will revisit learning outcomes for the GenAI era. And so now I'll pass it over to David. He'll tell you about writing learning outcomes.
Thanks, Jackie. So in this first section, we're going to briefly explain what we mean by learning outcomes. Let's think of learning outcomes as the finish line of a learning experience. This learning experience could be a lesson, an internship, or an entire academic program. But for today's purposes, we're going to be focusing on learning outcomes at the course level. Course level learning outcomes, or CLOs, are the intended destination for students, outlining the abilities a student should have after they have cleared the hurdles of their course, such as the content, activities, and assessments. CLOs answer the question for students, where am I going and how will I know when I get there? Let's begin with a quick 101. Learning outcomes are what students will be able to know, do, or value by the end of the course, and hopefully beyond. They are a mutual benefit to both instructors and students. When thoughtfully crafted, CLOs serve as both a compass for instructors and a map for students, as Boston's College Center for Teaching Excellence puts it. Before determining your CLOs, ask yourself, what will your students find useful for their academic, professional, and personal lives? To answer this question, it's helpful to reflect on the situational factors in play, both within and outside of your course. A situational analysis can strengthen your CLOs, be it for a brand new course or one that you've taught for many years. You may find that some outcomes need to be added, modified, or even removed to reflect changing times or circumstances. In this slide here, we've put together a list of factors that you might consider, and this is adapted from LD Fink's Integrated Course Design Framework. I probably won't go through the whole list, but as you can see, I've broken it down into subject matter, course, students, program, and beyond. And as you glance at this list, if you come back to it, keep generative AI in mind, as it will undoubtedly influence some of these more evergreen factors. Once you've reviewed the situational factors, you can then begin to tackle your learning outcomes. Learning outcomes are helpful because they help us to achieve constructive alignment, which is a principle attributed to John Biggs. The constructive in constructive alignment refers to constructivism, a learning theory positing that learners actively construct and negotiate knowledge through their experiences and social interactions. The alignment in constructive alignment is concerned with the coordination of course components towards a set of learning goals. As we see on this slide, we first define the intended learning outcomes at the top, and from there we select assessment methods and teaching and learning activities to support students in achieving said outcomes. Constructive alignment can be developed through backwards course design, a method attributed to Wiggins and McTee. It's backward because we start designing with that finish line in mind, and then address the course components that get us there. This stands in contrast to common habits that prioritize the course content as a starting point. So that's a common sort of instinct that we might have from time to time. Using the backward design method, we instead start by identifying the desired results, and then we determine acceptable evidence of results, and finally plan learning experiences to achieve these results. So in other words, with backwards design, the lessons enforce the assignments in turn are enforcing the learning outcomes, and the learning outcomes are really sort of the focal point of your design process. You're designing backwards, and of course, when the course starts, you're delivering it forwards. So what does a learning outcome look like? I'm sure we're all familiar, at a very quick level what it looks like, but let's just do a quick review. A learning outcome typically contains the following four components. First is the STEM, which outlines who is achieving the outcome and when it will be achieved. Second is an action verb, which specifies what the student will be able to do. Then a statement of what will be learned. And finally, a condition, which provides context or criteria as to how the outcome will be demonstrated. So if we were teaching an anthropology of music course, for instance, a potential learning outcome would be, by the end of this course, students will be able to synthesize ideas and concepts about music culture from across fields of study in psychology. As you work towards creating a set of course level learning outcomes, try to aim for about 5 or 10, as the conventional advice suggests somewhere in this range. Sorry, I've also seen 5 to 8, but yeah, somewhere in that number is probably a good idea. Make sure that each learning outcome is specific, observable, and measurable. Now let's look to this diagram on the slide of Bloom's taxonomy. To the right of this pyramid, we can see clusters of more precise verbs, such as define, discuss, and explain, in place of vague verbs like remember or understand, that describe internal mental processes and are harder to demonstrate or observe. The 6 main verbs in that pyramid, think of those as almost umbrellas or containers for more specific verbs that you can use when you are writing your CLOs. And as we keep our attention on these verbs, we can see the pyramid is arranged from lower order cognitive processes at the base, such as recall and identify, to higher order processes at the summit, like judge or design. It's good to have it's good to have a set of outcomes across this range, although at the course level, you tend to want to be emphasizing the higher order cognitive processes. That being said, cognition isn't everything. Depending on your discipline, you might want to consider how CLOs might also address psychomotor and affective learning domains. For a deeper dive into learning outcomes, there's a link at the bottom of the slide. It's a resource provided by the Higher Education Quality Council of Ontario. But for now, I'll hand it over to Jackie, who will shift our focus towards GenAI.
Awesome. Thanks, David. I think that was a great intro to CLOs, and I'm going to speak on what these CLOs might look like for us as educators as we grapple with generative artificial intelligence in our courses and educational contexts. So I wanted to start this off with an example. So I come from a chemistry background, so I've taught chemistry labs and tutorials and courses as well. And these are some common outcomes we might have for a traditional chemistry lab. So we want students to be able to demonstrate their abilities to collect accurate and precise experimental data, to analyze and interpret data to draw meaningful conclusions, and to write clear and concise lab reports and introduce different sections of a lab report. And so a key question for me in this context that we are in today with GenAI is, how might GenAI reshape how we approach and assess these existing learning outcomes that we have? Some additional questions we might think about are what skills are important for students to develop for their degrees and careers, et cetera. Some of the situational factors that David discussed earlier. But we also think about what supports students need. Are there ways that GenAI can provide the support? So the key question, I think, is how do we as educators embed GenAI into our courses and learning outcomes, if at all, while still protecting and or enhancing the skills and knowledge that we want students to learn and demonstrate? And so if you go to the next slide, please, David. Oh, thank you. I think this really presents us with an opportunity to reimagine what our learning outcomes could look like. Especially because these tools, these systems are constantly evolving and changing. They're increasingly demonstrating capabilities in skills like in knowledge synthesis and problem solving, and they're poised to really transform the landscape of education and the future of work, the skills that we value in the workplace and in our society in general. And so this presents us as an opportunity as educators to support students in both learning about how these tools work, and so embedding opportunities to learn about how these systems and these tools work within our courses, but they also present an immense potential for supporting and enhancing students' learning experiences and their ability to achieve and demonstrate certain learning outcomes that we value already in our courses. And so in other words, learning alongside or with these tools. And so I'll pass it over to David, who will talk about a bit more about revisiting learning outcomes for a GenAI era.
Thank you, Jackie. So in this section, I'm going to try to answer 3 questions related to learning outcomes in the Gen AI era. What's changed? What hasn't changed? And what can you do? So let's start with what's changed. Gen AI tools allow students to fast track many lower order cognitive tasks like remember and jump straight into higher order tasks like create. Now, we might see this as an affordance. This might be beneficial in helping to alleviate information paralysis and cognitive overload. It could also be detrimental if it's used in a way that circumvents human encoding processes, like cognitive encoding processes of new information that are needed for successful retrieval of that information later on. And of course, this could have big implications in real-world occupations where access to technology is not readily available. However, with intentionally designed activities and assessments, you could see this as an opportunity. You could invite students to ask GenAI to take more of a tutor role. And in this use case, GenAI could help with personalized practice and reinforcement of lower order cognitive skills to help make that content stick. GenAI is not just limited to, the tools rather, are not just limited to performing those lower order cognitive skills. We also see that it's adept at performing some of the more higher order ones like analysis. So we see as an affordance, you can see that GenAI tools can compare and contrast data, infer trends and themes, and even make predictions with inputs that are provided by students. However, as I'm sure we know, GenAI is not infallible. It has well-documented issues with bias and hallucinations. And in my experience with using even ChatGPT-4, which is like the latest and greatest, at least from ChatGPT, I find it still really lousy at producing accurate and relevant citations. Everyone's mileage will vary, but clearly there's still room for error with GenAI. However, with appropriate instructor guidance, students can take this a step further up the pyramid to interpret, interrogate, and ultimately evaluate the analytical work that the tool performed. So in this use case, a student might interact with a GenAI tool, ask it to provide analysis on a specific thing, and then with instructor guidance and maybe some guiding questions or some outcomes, you can ask students to take that a step further and engage in metacognitive reflection. That is, thinking about thinking. Students can holistically judge the output that the GenAI tool does and improve upon it, either alone or in collaboration with classmates. When we're considering useful and pedagogically justified opportunities to learn with GenAI, it's worth asking, which AI capabilities and distinctive human skills do you wish to emphasize? This useful table provided by Oregon State University eCampus compares AI and abilities across 6 levels of Bloom's taxonomy. In their analysis, they suggest paying most attention to learning outcomes in the remember or analyze levels, as these are most likely to be needed of amendment in a post-GenAI landscape. Won't go through the whole table, but let's look at the remember level as an example. So according to this table, AI can recall factual information, list possible answers, define a term, and construct a basic chronology. But only a human can perform these tasks in situations where technology isn't readily accessible. So this, for me, underscores the continued importance of experiential learning opportunities where students can apply information in specific dynamic and novel contexts. On this slide, the University of Toronto Centre for Teaching Support and Innovation provides examples of how learning outcomes could be modified to reflect the distinctions between human and Gen AI capabilities. Notice how the outcomes in the after column are more descriptive and end with conditions that more precisely articulate the context in which students will be expected to demonstrate their learning. None of these revised outcomes prescribe or forbid the use of Gen AI, but instead guide students toward outcomes that are generally higher order and tied to more authentic real-world problems. Again, won't read everything on this slide, but let's look at the example provided for the medicine domain. A pre-Gen AI outcome might have asked students to compare and contrast how promotional health resources effectively and accurately present information to patient care. When we consider human skills in relation to Gen AI, we might instead ask students to assess the accuracy, reliability, and relevance of these sources, as well as identifying biases and areas for improvement in patient care. So we've discussed how Gen AI might change your approach to learning outcomes, but what remains the same? So last week, community principles and guidelines on Gen AI for TMU were published. The link in the slide will point you there, and we'll share that as well in the resources at the end. It's worth having a read of these in full, but I'll highlight one here for you. Namely, the guideline states, unless explicitly communicated by the course instructor, the use of Gen AI for coursework is not permitted, which means that you do not need to permit or promote use of Gen AI if you don't feel it's pedagogically appropriate in your course to do so. Students are still bound by academic integrity responsibilities and should refer to the course outline for any guidance on, guidance on if and how they might use Gen AI tools. So that's still basically that's still the same. Now, of course, this does not suggest that you should strictly stick to traditional forms of assessment. High stakes invigilated exams have had well-documented problems long before Gen AI. Regardless of what forms of assessment you use, what does remain true is that students will be motivated to complete those assessments and those tasks when they know why it is important and relevant to their learning. If your course level learning outcomes are aligned with your assignments, you can make a stronger case to your students to do the work. As well, there are still areas where Gen AI is lacking, at least for now. For example, humans are still best positioned to make insights and connections in local contexts, such as your classroom or the community, about very recent events, as most Gen AI models have a data cutoff date. And humans are better at drawing connections that engage emotional, interpersonal, or ethical considerations. So we've arrived at the last question. What can you do? What can you do with your course level learning outcomes to address this moment? On this slide, I have some suggestions that are focused really on the learning outcomes. So first, you can review your existing CLOs in light of situational factors related to Gen AI, asking yourself, which distinctly human skills do I want to foreground? What digital literacy skills will students need to use Gen AI mindfully in both academic and professional settings? And can Gen AI be leveraged to practice or even enhance certain cognitive skills? Once you've done that, you can add, remove, or revise your outcomes as needed, particularly those at the remember and analyze levels, as Oregon State University's analysis found. And when you're phrasing your outcomes, provide conditions towards the end that promote creativity, metacognitive reflection, real-world application, and collaboration with others. Again, highlighting more of those sort of human capabilities. And then now you would be in a position to start designing your assessments. Now, assessment design was out of scope for today's topic. Our next workshop, though, I believe later this week, I think it's on Wednesday, will tackle Gen AI in written assignments. But for now, we will briefly touch upon assessment design. And I'll remind you that you want to align your assignment and activity choices to your CLOs. If it's for a course you've taught before, reflect on the strengths and weaknesses on the strengths and weaknesses of the assignments you've used in the past. What were the common pain points that students encountered? Would Gen AI tools alleviate or aggravate those issues? And if so, how? Also consider choosing assessments that promote more active, authentic, and relational learning experiences. And consider using assessment design techniques like scaffolding, which break down larger summative assignments into smaller chunks and provide students with more opportunities for human feedback. This helps in measuring the learning process, sometimes called formative learning, and not just the end product. And I'm just going to turn it back to Jackie to revisit that chemistry example from earlier.
Awesome. Thanks, David. So on the topic of, trying to find ways to embed these tools into our learning outcomes and our assignments, we revisit this example I shared earlier with the chemistry lab reports. These are all outcomes that I value as a chemistry instructor, and these are all outcomes that I think students should be able to demonstrate by the end of the course, because I think they're going to be important for them later on in their careers. These abilities to collect data, analyze that data, and synthesize that information into some sort of written report or summary. However, I also recognize that students, especially at the undergraduate level, are still learning how to write these types of reports in an academic setting, and that many students in the classroom may be learning English as they go through their degrees. And so I'm thinking about those pain points that David touched on the previous slides. So in this context, ChatGPT and tools like it serve not only as a fantastic writing tool to scaffold students in the writing process and to support their ability to demonstrate and achieve some of these outcomes that I have in that I want them to achieve, but also as a way to support equitable achievement of the learning outcomes. And so one way I can do this in an assignment in a lab report context is make explicit to the students that these tools can be used for specific purposes, in this case, editing, and then I can evaluate both the outputs in a way that preserves the integrity of the skills I actually care about measuring. And so to close this section, what can you do? Once the course is up and running, we can refer back to the learning outcomes and course outline whenever you communicate to students about the purpose and value of your assignments and learning activities, which tasks you encourage them to use GenAI for, if any, and those you do not, so any permissible uses of GenAI. And then lastly, ethical and responsible use of GenAI, the importance of using these tools in a fashion that is ethical and responsible.